Okay, so just so you know, there are a lot of people listening to this episode who are really hoping that you'll confirm that I was in a cult. How would you audit someone from my group to find out if it was a cult?
There are 3 core characteristics to determine whether or not a group is or is not a destructive cult.
Welcome back to If I'm Really Honest, where I seek truth without tribalism. It's a place where ignorance isn't punished, curiosity is rewarded, and conflict doesn't mean contempt. If you have watched any documentary on cults or interviews about cults, you're already familiar with my next guest. Rick Alan Ross is widely known as just the cult expert, and his book, Cults Inside and Out, is widely known as the Cults Book. Many of you know my story from almostacult.com, and so you already know why this conversation is so fun for me in particular. Somehow we did a decent job of staying on topic and avoiding many of the rabbit trails that could have turned into their own multi-hour episodes on their own. If you want to hear such rabbit trails in the future, then make sure you let the algorithms know that you want to hear it when it's released. But for now, I give you a surprisingly focused conversation on cults and narcissism and psychopathy and Waco and Nexium and so much more with the legendary Rick Alan Ross. Is there a cult that you encountered that was most fascinating to you or that stood out?
There have been quite a few. I mean, I've dealt with so many. I would say the one that many people are fascinated with is Nexium, Keith Raniere.
Right.
I dealt with him for many years and met him personally, dealt with him face to face, testified at his criminal trial. And then Eligio Bishop. He was recently convicted of rape and unlawful imprisonment, and I testified as an expert at his criminal trial, and he's now sentenced to life in prison. And he's kind of interesting because he recruited online, he used social media platforms and Airbnb to book his compound.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. So that was an interesting group. And I think what's interesting now are all these groups that are proliferating online and the use of social media and how that's integral to their inception, their recruitment, and their fundraising.
Right. Yeah. Can you talk more about how that happens or how someone who's getting into one of those might, what are some of the warning signs that you're joining an online cult?
Well, I think that if you're in a group or you're involved in a group online and you begin to see that the group is fascinated, enthralled with the leader, and that the leader can do no wrong, and that the leader has absolute control, and there's no transparency or accountability regarding donations, there's no democratic governance regarding the organization. So you begin to realize you're dealing with a totalitarian group, whether it be a religious group or a philosophical group or whatever, a wellness group, but it could be a cult. And so then you want to step back and really carefully evaluate what you're getting involved in. Are there people that have left? What do they have to say? How does the group respond to people who leave? Do they stigmatize them? Do they accept the idea that people can leave without being considered negative or wrong if they consider leaving? So those are some of the warning signs that you look for in groups online, or for that matter, not online, that you should be aware of.
So then one of the things I've heard you say a lot is that the leader is an important part of it being a cult, that the leader is worshipped. Now in the case of, at least in my experience, the religious cults or the ones that are based on religion that already exists, the leader is not officially worshipped. They're explicitly not worshipped, like they're worshiping God, but they're just unquestionable. Can you talk more about the word worshipped? Because it feels like that would be denied, or that wouldn't feel like it applied in a lot of those cases.
That is a tricky one. So, for example, in the case of David Koresh of the Waco Davidians, he was literally worshipped as a messianic figure. He was the Messiah. He was going to judge the world. And so he was considered essentially divine or semi-divine. What religious cults do is they have a leader who will not necessarily claim to be divine or claim to be a supernatural being, but rather say, look, I speak with authority. I'm a prophet. I am a conduit for God to speak to the world. So when I speak to you and tell you things about what I think the Bible means, what I think a particular verse in the Bible means, etc., that's coming from God through me. And so people may not worship the individual per se, but in reality, that individual leader represents the higher power on earth and cannot be uh, criticized, cannot be contradicted. And so when you have a leader like that who is essentially God's mouthpiece, and you feel you cannot disagree, they may not be an object of worship in an explicit sense, but essentially they are. Because when you talk to the people in the group and you say, well, how do you know what God wants you to do? How do you know? Typically in a Bible-based group that is mainstream, they would say, well, I read the Bible, I know the 10 Commandments, I follow the basic doctrines of my group, be it Methodist, Roman Catholic, Jewish, or whatever. But when someone is in a destructive cult that is religiously based, they will reference the leader and they will say, well, look, Jim Jones said, David Koresh said, and whoever the leader is determining what the Bible means and what God expects.
Okay, so just so you know, there are a lot of people listening to this episode who are really hoping that you'll confirm that I was in a cult. So how would you audit someone from a group, from my group, to find out if it was a cult?
Well, it's not just a question of, is the group a destructive cult? The question also is the group potentially unsafe? It may be an authoritarian group that may not fit exactly the profile of a destructive cult. There are 3 core characteristics to determine whether or not a group is or is not a destructive cult. And these were first, written about by Robert J. Lifton, who
Right.
just died recently at the age of 99. Lifton taught at Harvard Medical School, Yale, and he was a psychiatrist who wrote the book Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, which
Right.
is really the go-to book to understand what we commonly call brainwashing. Lifton wrote a paper that was published at Harvard in the 80s, and in my opinion, and I would say historically, this is borne out, Lifton identified what I would call the nucleus for the definition of a destructive cult. That is that all the definitions seem to intersect these 3 core criteria. Number 1, that the group has an all-powerful, absolute authoritarian leader who has little, if any, meaningful accountability, becomes an object of worship, and is the defining element and driving force of the group. The group is clearly, in that sense, a personality-driven group. Second, that leader uses identifiable techniques of coercive persuasion and thought reform to gain undue influence over his followers. And third, the leader then uses that undue influence to exploit and do harm to his followers. And that may vary by degree from group to group. For example, some groups are just after money, free labor, maybe sexual favors for the leader. But then it can become much worse than that when there is extreme physical abuse, medical neglect, people are dying, or even criminal behavior, as we've seen in groups like Aum Shinrikyo in Japan when they attacked the Tokyo subway system, or the Waco Davidians when they stockpiled weapons and had a shootout with federal officers. So you look for those three core criteria: the all-powerful leader who becomes an object of worship, the existence of a thought reform program that is being used by the leader to gain undue influence, and finally, the destructive nature of the group. Harm is being done. So it's not about what people believe doctrinally. It's about how they behave and how the group is structured and how authority is handled, how it is how it is relegated within the group.
So then it feels to me like then there is a spectrum and not necessarily a clear defining line that something becomes a cult. How clearly can you make that line, or how clearly do you think that line is?
Well, I think there are many groups that use forms of intense indoctrination that might be parallel to thought reform. And I think there are many groups that do harm that might be, for example, considered clergy abuse, sexual abuse of minor children in different groups, such as the clergy abuse that we've all read about in the Roman Catholic Church, or the clergy abuse, or I should say leadership abuse, because they don't really have ordained clergy within Jehovah's Witnesses. But the single most salient feature of a destructive cult is the all-powerful leader, the dictatorial leader, and the fact that the group is personality-driven by that leader. So that may be a feature lacking in some groups, where they are cult-like in their behavior, in their process of indoctrination, in the way in which they recruit and retain members, and they may be harmful to some degree with complaints about the harm that they do, but they don't have that all-powerful leader. For example, they might have a governing body. They might have some form of governance that is even somewhat democratic, in the sense that there are some type of election or selection process within the group that is not run by one single person who is a dictator. So that may be the dividing line, that divides an authoritarian, controlling, and destructive group from a destructive cult.
Are there sometimes like a pair, like a husband and wife or something like that, that are the leader together? Or is it always
Yes.
just one?
Yes.
Okay.
For example, the Heaven's Gate, which had
Right.
Marshall Applewhite and Bonnie Nettles. They called themselves at one point T and Doe, and they were a duo. Another group that I dealt with, the Eternal Flame, that was later called People Unlimited or People Forever, was ruled over by a triumvirate of three people: Charles Brown, Bernadine Brown, and James Stroll. The Browns died. Now Stroll seems to run the group. But there can be, a combination of people at the top in some situations. But typically, when we're talking about a destructive cult, and you can go through the historical groups, Charles Manson, uh, Jim Jones, Marshall Applewhite, who I mentioned, Keith Raniere of Nexium, Shoko Asahara of Aum Shinrikyo. We could go down the list, and what we see is one leader who has this all-powerful dictatorial control over the group, and who is identified as the defining element and driving force of the group. That is, whatever he says is right, whatever he says is wrong, and everyone locksteps behind that leader. And the leader can do a complete 180 from one day to the next. And the people in the group will make that change with the leader. So the leader may say one day, the sky is purple. And people will say, well, yeah, the sky's purple. And the next day, the leader says, the sky is really red. And so everyone will say, well, now that you mention it, yeah, it's
Right.
red. So,
Yeah.
so whatever the leader determines is real and true becomes the core of how the people in the group believe and what they say and how they live their lives.
Now, I've heard you say that the cult leaders are always the same. Like it's the same when you're interviewing the cult leaders. Like it's like you're interviewing the same person over and over. Can you describe that archetype? Like if you were just gonna tell me about a generic cult leader, what's this person like?
Very narcissistic. If you look at the profile for narcissistic personality disorder, I think that's typical. So you have someone who is self-obsessed, very arrogant, condescending, this varies by degree, and it can be tempered by whether the cult leader is an extrovert, which is fairly common, or they may be introverted, as Keith Raniere was.
Right.
So they may display their narcissistic traits somewhat differently, but they lack empathy. They have little, if any, sympathy for anyone other than themselves. They have grandiose delusions, of self-importance, of the ordering of human existence around themselves, who they see as the center of the known universe. And they've often been described as malignant narcissists. And also, many of them have been uh, labeled by mental health professionals as psychopaths or sociopaths. That
Right.
is, they don't really see things in terms of right or wrong. Everything for them is relative. If it's good for me, it's good. If it's bad for me, it's bad. And that's how they determine, what is right, what is wrong. And they tend to, uh, you know, they can be quite cruel because they have no sense of right or wrong. They have no empathy. They have little sympathy. And so the abuse can flow from that kind of a personality. But when I meet them, they virtually never will admit when they are wrong about anything. They will never, to say that they lack self-awareness, for example, is an understatement. They don't deal in self-deprecating humor typically, and they're very thin-skinned. So basically, if you say, "I think you're wrong about this," or "I'm not quite sure that formula really works," or you question something that they do, they tend to become increasingly agitated and they may have a meltdown.
Now, is there a gender split as far as female cult leaders and male cult leaders that their archetypes would be different from each other? Do they tend to lead in different ways?
The personality profile would be essentially the same, though some cult leaders are much worse than others. I mean, some are simply satisfied with money, a certain level of power. They do not become as abusive as others may. For example, Keith Raniere, who tortured women and branded them had them branded with a cauterizing iron. He was very cruel. And another thing about cult leaders, they may evolve over a period of time. Typically, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So the cult leader may start out not being as bad as they end up. In my experience, David Koresh, for example, who I first knew as Vernon Howe, he wasn't really quite as bad as he became later. He became worse and worse and worse. Though quite frankly, he started out fairly badly.
Right. Okay.
Keith Raniere less so. He there was this trajectory of his behavior in which he became much, much more harsh and much more severe as the years went on.
So going back to David Koresh, he strikes me as a person who didn't know what he didn't know. Just having read about it, not having the relationship you did with the organization, it seems like all the members bought into it. They truly believed, and it seemed like David Koresh really believed too. Did he know what he was doing?
I think he started out as a con man, but I think he ended up being a true believer. Because he took his own life and made sure that everyone in the compound that he could cause to die died with him. And it seems to me that in the early years he wasn't quite like that. Keep in mind that I was dealing with the Waco Davidians for about 5 years before the standoff began, before the raid with the BATF and the standoff. So things became much worse over a period of time. And I can remember at one point where a young man in the compound had a nervous breakdown. And no doubt from the stress of being in that compound and being in the group.
Right.
And he eventually ended up back at his mother's home in Colorado. And David Koresh had one of his followers literally drive him home and dump him at his mother's doorstep. I saw that as being very pragmatic, that Koresh didn't really want someone there that was high maintenance, that he didn't want to take responsibility legally for someone who was, in distress, and things might get worse. And so he was being very practical, very businesslike in the way in which he delegated one of his followers to deal with this by dumping this poor young man at his mother's doorstep. And that wasn't really the action of someone that was a true believer in his own power. I think that if at that point Koresh had thought, well, I am the Messiah, I am like Jesus, I am all powerful, he would have thought, well, I can heal this guy. He can stay here. Why should I let him go? He needs to be here with me because the world is coming to an end and doomsday is around the corner. But that wasn't the way that Koresh handled it. He handled it the way someone would, mitigating possible legal liability. And so I saw him as being rather pragmatic there. But at the end, it was like he seemed to truly believe that he was the Messiah and that he was here to judge the world. And he ultimately decided that he would rather die than face accountability with the outside world, the court system, prison, etc.
So this is where, for me, the difference between the religious cults and the non-religious cults seems tricky, because it seems like in the religious cults, there is, like, the words that describe the non-religious cults, for example, like you said, whatever they say is true, and they can change their mind. Well, if it's not a religious cult, then that is a leader. We're following a leader, like a Steve Jobs, or obviously, like, he's the guy. Like he's the guy. We're all following the guy, and we all know that. We just don't necessarily appreciate how destructive that is to us. In a religious cult, it seems to me like the person at the top it's not just about a matter of what they say is true, but what is revealed to them about truth. So it's not them changing their mind. It's just them understanding truth in a different way. Or like in the example of like cutting people off, like, well, sure. I mean, God could heal this person, or I could heal this person, but also if they're choosing to be evil, they're choosing their sin, whatever, like that's on them. And so it seems like in a religious cult, there's an easier plausible deniability or something, because it's not the leader necessarily that's making the decision in the minds of the followers and perhaps the leader. Am I looking at that wrong?
Well, first of all, let's acknowledge that a lot of cults are not religious. For example, Nexium was a
Right.
seminar selling company that was devoted to self-improvement, supposedly. There was nothing religious about Nexium. And the philosophy that Keith Raniere taught was called rational inquiry. And it was basically an amalgam of Scientology, Ayn Rand, Amway, and the Socratic method of question and answer.
Yeah.
And a lot of what I read in their program notes was taken directly from Scientology. For example, designating people that were critical as suppressive persons or
Right.
SPs.
They use the same language,
Yeah,
suppressive
that
persons?
they used
Oh, that's
exactly the
funny.
same
Okay.
language. And that when I saw those notes for the intensive that were distributed to people that were participants, I realized immediately this isn't a coincidence. They copied Scientology, which is an ironic kind of twist because Keith Raniere sued me for 14 years for copyright infringement and trade secret violation, when in fact he was himself a plagiarist.
Right.
So it's beyond bizarre, but welcome to cult world,
Right.
it's kind of an upside down world. But having said that about Nexium, Nexium and another example would be Synanon, the drug rehabilitation community. That was not religious, though it was incorporated kind of as a church, but it really was more like a 12-step kind of spin-off because the founder, Charles Diedrich, was an AA guy. And so he created this group, which was supposed to be a rehabilitative community. So there are groups that have nothing to do with religion at all and are cults, which is, again, defined by the nature of leadership, the structure of authority, and the behavior of the group, not about what it believes. So you could have a cult that could be a corporate cult, and I can understand you saying that Steve Jobs was a charismatic leader, that he
Yes.
was the defining element and driving force of Apple, and that everything was about Steve Jobs when he was alive. But I would argue that he was not a destructive cult leader.
Right.
He had a temper. He could really be harsh with people when they didn't meet his expectations. But generally speaking, he paid people. They had benefits. They had stock options. He made people rich.
Right.
And he produced a product that, many people greatly appreciate. His his laptops, his iPod, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't necessarily see Jobs as a destructive cult leader, but
Right.
I think that someone could be a cult leader and be benign. And there is such a thing as relatively benign cults that have existed. And also let's just point out that there's a range of meaning to the word cult. So for example, you might be an avid Trader Joe's shopper, as I am. And so you're devoted to a cult brand. And that would be one form of using the word cult. Or
Right.
you could be a Swiftie. You love Taylor Swift and you go to all of her concerts, buy all of her music. And in that sense, you're part of a cult following. So we need to make distinctions between what is a destructive cult, what is a benign cult, what is a cult following, a cult brand, because I think the word cult often today is being abused. The word's just being thrown around and used to denigrate a group or a belief system or a movement that we don't like.
Well, and that was part of my thesis when I wrote my blog about the organization my parents ran, which was almost a cult, which was kind of like, let's take the word cults out of this and just ask, was it destructive? If it was, then it was destructive and it was bad for you. And if it wasn't, then like the word cult doesn't necessarily need to be brought into the conversation. You can evaluate whether this group is doing you harm or not without the vocabulary cult attached to it.
Yeah. you ask yourself, is there an authoritarian leader in this group? How is this group or organization governed? What are its bylaws? What are the checks and balances? How is their accountability? And then, is there a history of complaints about this group? Can I go online and find people that were once involved that now describe it as a negative experience and that they were hurt in some way? Is there a legitimate way to critique this group when people express doubts or misgivings about something or criticism? How is that received? And how does the group treat people who have left? Are they denigrated? Are they stigmatized? Or are they still friendly with other group members, even though they no longer attend meetings or actively involved in maybe as volunteers or whatever? Is there a we they philosophy within the group? We are the good guys and everybody else is suspect out there. They're not really on the team and they're bad. How does the group regard people outside? And is does the group have and encourage unreasonable fears about the outside world, and insinuate somehow, if you aren't with us, you'll be sorry. You'll be very, very sorry. So and by becoming involved in the group, are you becoming socially isolated? Are you withdrawing from old friends and family? And are you becoming so embedded within the subculture of the group, the milieu of the group, that you're neglecting everyone else? And does the group encourage you to do that? Are other members in the group typically like that? Is that normal for the group to become increasingly socially isolated? All of these things are red flags. Now, having said that, there are groups that start out as a destructive cult and then change and evolve. Now, the leader dies, and some groups, after the leader dies, they just disintegrate, either rapidly or slowly, and then they just cease to exist, because the leader, that all-powerful leader, is in essence the organizational glue that holds the group together. But let's take a group like the Mormons. In my opinion, the Mormon Church began as a personality cult. It was led by Joseph Smith, subsequently Brigham Young, and it was personality driven. That Smith found the so-called golden plates, that he authored or he transcribed or translated, according to the Mormons, the Book of Mormon. And then he dies, and then Brigham Young takes over, and he takes them to Utah, and they continue to be personality driven. But after Young dies, then you have a governing body, and power is devolving from the top. There's no longer one leader. And today, the Mormon Church has, the first council of the presidency. The president and prophet is chosen by the council. And then you have the first quorum of the 70, second quorum of the 70, and there is a government over the Mormon Church. So they can be seen as an organization that began as a typical personality cult that revolved around a charismatic leader, but over the last 100+ years, they've changed. And I would say they are moving more and more to the mainstream, though in many ways slowly. And Jehovah's Witnesses would be another example, that they started with, Charles Taze Russell, and then subsequently a man by the name of Rutherford took over the group. But then after that, you have the governing body today, which is a group of typically a dozen or so older men who run the organization. I would still consider Jehovah's Witnesses a destructive authoritarian group. They don't believe in blood transfusions, and people die every year, particularly women in childbirth. And they also have very harsh teachings about disfellowshipping and shunning. And they are very, uh, ethnocentric in the sense that they believe that only they have the truth. And that is why Jehovah's Witnesses are not in the military and they don't register in political parties, not because they're pacifists like the Quakers, but because the organization teaches that there is only one organized group on the face of the earth that is the correct group to be involved in, and that's Jehovah's Witnesses, which speak for Jehovah God. So that's a group that's evolved over the last 100 years as well. So it is possible for a group to begin as a destructive cult and evolve, and they can evolve to the point that they become mainstream, which I think the Seventh-day Adventists have done,
Right.
which is the group that David Koresh, Vernon Howell was once involved in, and then he left. And they uh, literally pushed him out. They didn't want him. And so the Adventists began as a group that was first known as the Millerites, as the Jehovah's Witnesses were known as the Russellites, the name of the founder. And then when this man Miller, his prediction for the end of the world did not come to pass, the group began to reorganize. And then a woman named Ellen White became the preeminent charismatic leader and responsible for many writings that Adventists follow today. For example, her beliefs on diet, exercise, and so forth. But the Adventists evolved and changed until they became a democratically governed religious denomination, very much more mainstream than the Mormons or Jehovah's Witnesses. And in my opinion, a completely benign group that I never get complaints about.
And so then, from my perspective, even if you have that happening and you've got a benign organization, you can have individual chapters or wards or congregations within that are run in a cultish way, which it seems to be the way that a lot of the religious cults first start out. Is we were just a part of this, but then we decided we were a little bit better than them. We don't necessarily need all that oversight anymore, and they can break off. So just because you're in Mormonism, and Rick Allen Ross says Mormonism is an occult, so I'm safe here in this ward. Well, it depends on how that ward is run.
Well, no. Let me define that a little bit more clearly. So what you're now alluding to are splinter groups. And every religion, whether it's Judaism, Christianity, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, all have splinter groups that have become known as destructive cults, and very negatively so. So it is possible for a group to splinter. Let's look at, for example, the Branch Davidians.
Yeah.
There was a man by the name of Victor Houteff who was a Seventh-day Adventist. He converted to become a Seventh-day Adventist. His actual background was, I think, Greek Orthodox or Russian Orthodox. But he became an Adventist, and then he said he knew a better way. And he had a series of writings that were called The Shepherd's Rod. And the Adventists heard him out. He claimed to be a prophet. And of course, Adventists have a history of having prophets, whether it was Miller or Ellen White or whatever. So they were willing to listen to Houteff. But at the end, they said, "You're not a prophet. We don't recognize you. And if you continue to preach things that are divisive and cause strife within our churches, we don't want you." And he was put out the door. And then he went eventually to the area of Waco, Texas, and he created a kind of intentional community. And initially, it was very peaceful. And then Houteff died. His widow took over, and then there was a succession of leaders. The
Can I ask
Rodens.
real
Pardon?
quick? Can I ask in there when that was happening? Did he still consider himself like a Seventh Day Adventist, but just the only good one? Like we're doing it the right way, or no?
No. After they put him out, that is the Adventists, saw Houteff as a schismatic, kind of breakaway group. and the group became the Branch Davidians. They became known as the Davidians.
Right. They didn't see themselves as Adventists at that point.
No, they saw themselves as a group with roots in Adventism, and they maintained a vegetarian diet, which the Adventists are known for. And there were certain other things that they may have taken along as kind of baggage from being Adventists. And they would continue to target Seventh-day Adventist churches for decades. They would send their people to recruit and try to pull people out of the Adventist church. So, for example, when David Koresh became a problem in Texas, and he was a problem before he was widely known. He was prosecuted for attempted murder. He was fighting for the leadership role after a leader, Lois Roden, died, and her son was going to take over the group, George Roden Jr. And Koresh, who was then known by his given name, Vernon Howell, he wanted to be the leader. And he was much more of a charismatic, well-spoken, very glib kind of leader than George Roden Jr., who was a troubled young man. And so the end result was that Koresh and Roden were at odds with each other for control of the real estate, control of the compound and the followers. And Koresh had his people try to kill George Roden Jr. And they had guns and they tried to murder him. And so Vernon Howell, aka David Koresh, was then tried for attempted murder. And the jury was hung. And so he was able to get out of that situation, and he went back to the compound, and George Roden Jr. was then out of the picture. Yeah. So from the very beginning in the 80s, David Koresh was a violent criminal kind of person. But it's important to note that for many, many years, the Davidians outside of Waco were a very peaceful group, a benign group. A group that might be considered a benign cult. And then with the change in leadership, when David Koresh became the leader, everything changed, and they started stockpiling more and more weapons, ammunition, and it became almost militarized within the compound. So right. It's important to kind of see that trajectory. A group can become increasingly benign, less destructive, and evolve and become mainstream, or a group may have been benign and then with a new leader, because they have a dictatorial leadership, and that new leader is like a king, and the new king isn't a nice king. And so that's what happened when David Koresh took power over the Branch Davidians outside Waco.
Yeah. What is there anything you think that the government could have done better? How could that have gone better than it did?
There are a lot of things that could have been done better. First of all, raiding the compound the way they did was very ill-advised. I certainly was shocked when that raid took place. I couldn't believe that, knowing how heavily armed the group was and the extent of their weaponry, that the BATF went in the way they did. It was just very, very foolish.
Yeah.
And so I think what they should have done, in my opinion, is worked with the local sheriff and tried to either arrest David Koresh when he was outside of the compound, or encircle the compound and then have the sheriff call in and say, look, we're here to serve a warrant. We don't want trouble. And it could have started out in a very peaceful, reasonable way. Now, having said that, David Koresh was not very reasonable. This was a man that raped a 10-year-old child. He raped children. There were children having babies, his babies, in the compound. And his idea of corporal punishment of children and the way in which they were treated was horrible. So this was not a nice guy in the compound. This was a psychopath, a pedophile, someone who was really genuinely evil. But that having been said, look, there was a better approach that they could have done. And when the FBI took over, I think that they, in many ways, missed using tactics that could have been more productive. For example, they set up loudspeakers around the compound, and they used them to keep the Davidians up at night. They would play music, they would play rabbits screaming, different bizarre things. And in my experience, that is the antithesis of what you really should be doing. And I
Right.
told the FBI that at the time, which is let them get a good night's sleep. Because the more well rested they are, the more coherent and clear thinking they will be. And the FBI did not take that advice. And also, what I encourage them to do is use the loudspeakers only during, working hours, like 9 to 5, and allow families to either speak live through that PA system or to make audio tapes, recordings that could be played, saying things like, "Look, it's mom, it's dad. We love you. We're here. We're ready to take you home. We're ready to help you. We have a lawyer. We don't want you to get hurt. Please come out." I think if they had had that kind of communication, more people might have left. There was a significant amount of people that trickled out of the compound. There were 21 children,
Right.
for example, that got out. So I think that if the FBI had been a little bit more uh, wise tactically in the way in which they used the PA system, in the way in which they, for example, could have liaison families trying to help loved ones leave, they could have been more effective. But in the final analysis, David Koresh was king of the compound, and things were going to end the way he wanted them to end. And he wasn't like Charlie Manson. He didn't want to have a fan base sending him letters while he was in prison and do interviews periodically as an inmate. Charlie Manson had been an inmate for a great deal of his life. He was used to prison.
Hmm.
David Koresh was not. And he was like Jim Jones. He wanted to go out with a bang. He wanted to literally end his life rather than submit to any authority other than his own. So this is the way Jim Jones was. This is the way David Koresh was. And there have been other cult leaders like that. And that is that they would rather die than submit to any authority.
So then you've been doing this for several decades. You've got over 500 interventions yourself. How have you seen that change over the years, the approach to interventions? And do you think it's changed for the better or the worse? And in what ways?
Well, no one does involuntary interventions with adults. I was probably one of the last culty programmers to do involuntaries with adults. Now, let me just say in defense of why that was done, why the families chose to do that. They felt, and I think rightfully so, that they had no other alternative, that they could not access, visit, communicate with their loved ones. And so by kidnapping them, which wasn't a conventional kidnapping because it's your family that loves
Right.
you. No one's holding you for ransom. No one's going to hurt you. And ultimately, it's only for a few days because the families would say to their loved ones, all we want is a few days to explain to you why we are so worried and upset about your involvement with this group. At the end of these few days, if you want to go back, you can go back. We're not going to stop you. All we're looking for is a block of time free of the group, away from the group and its influence, to talk to you about why we are worried about you and about your future. And of course, I, as a deprogrammer, would facilitate the discussion. The family would be there and so on. But that type of intervention, because of all the legal considerations, um, ended in the 90s. Actually, I guess the last involuntaries with adults uh, took place over 30 years ago. So that's over.
Yeah.
So any intervention that's done now is done with the consent and cooperation of the person that is the focus of the intervention.
Right.
And typically they will stay because their family has pled with them and begged them literally to stay. Now, having said that, there are many families that I have to say, look, your son, your daughter is in this compound. They're in this place where you have no access to them. They have not communicated with you for some time. They are unlikely to agree to any meeting, as you know, and so I can't help you. But most of the families are not in that extreme of a situation. And so there is some level of access, there is communication, and then you nurture that communication to the point where you can have a sit down discussion with that person. And that's when I come in and do the intervention. And I still do those interventions, though I think that interventions are being done less and less, and that this is really kind of a fading field, that there are very few people like me left, scattered around the world, and that I don't see it as necessarily a growing profession where there will be more and more. And that's why I wrote the book Cults Inside Out, because I wanted to share everything that I've done over the past 40 years plus in interventions, hundreds of interventions. I want to share, how did I do that? What were the steps in those interventions? And so the book really breaks it down in very fine detail as to what transpires during an intervention, how it's set up, and then what takes place through case vignettes, examples that are in the book. And I hope that that book will be a guide for people doing family interventions in one way or another in the future.
Yeah. If you could go back 40 years and give yourself advice about how to do interventions, what would you recommend to yourself?
Well, I think that in the late 80s, when I did involuntary interventions with adults, that I did have quite a bit of success, and there were people that I was able to help, and that families were very happy to get loved ones out. But that if I had to go back and do it over again, I don't think I would have done involuntary interventions with adults, because I ended up spending an awful lot of time in court, and there were so many legal problems with that it almost ended my career. I mean, there was a particular case, the Jason Scott case, that took place around 1990, and that was almost the end of my career. So I think that from a practical standpoint, if I was talking to my younger self in 1988, 89, I would say, hey, don't do that. Just take the interventions that are voluntaries, or you could do an involuntary for parents of a minor child who is exercising their parental rights, their custodial rights, to extract that child from a destructive cult. And in cases like that, which I continue to take, the police will help, because the cult has no legal right to dominate the life of a minor child, that they must have the consent of the parents. And so in those situations, I can still be helpful.
Yeah. During the intervention itself, do you feel like your approach then was similar to your approach now, or your attitude about it, or your interaction with the person, taking out the captive audience aspect of it?
Yeah, it was pretty much the same. I mean, you could be somewhat more assertive in an involuntary with an adult than you would be in a voluntary intervention, because if you're confrontational, too assertive, or aggressive, a person will just say, I don't want to talk to you anymore and leave. So you have to be you have to be very kind of functioning on a more reasonable, easygoing level in that sense. But when you're dealing with people historically that were in cults that were so extreme that the family had no access whatsoever to their adult child, these were very extreme groups. And when I would meet with the person, they would almost be in a hypnotic trance. Their eyes would be like this, they'd look at you kind of blankly, and it was difficult to reach them. And so sometimes you had to be more assertive, you had to be more confrontational just to break through. But having said that, I think that over these last 4+ decades, I've constantly refined my approach, and I would say that I've become more organized, I've become, more methodical, that the approach is more nuanced, than it once was, and that just comes with anyone, whatever your profession, be you a lawyer, a doctor, a teacher, a pharmacist, whatever. You will improve as the years go by and your approach will get better. I think the best parallel would be to a teacher, teaching students, because my approach in intervention is educational. It's not counseling, it's not therapy. It's about, educating the person about, well, what is a destructive cult? What is thought reform? What does that look like? How can I distinguish it from other forms of persuasion? What are its telling traits? How can we pop that open and look at that? So that is what an intervention entails. I would break it down to 4 basic blocks of discussion, which I go over in my book, which is number 1, defining a destructive cult. Number 2, a discussion of coercive persuasion and thought reform. Number 3, information specifically about the group in question. In particular, what has the group concealed from you? Is there information that they have not shared with you that they should have shared to be more transparent and more honest about what they're all about what their expectations are of you, about where they're taking you in this process? What should you know to make a more informed decision about where you go from here? And then finally, the 4th block, why is your family sitting here? Why are they so worried about you? What are their concerns? What caused them to be concerned enough to stage an intervention? And so you take those 4 blocks, and that is the nature of the intervention dialogue or discussion. And it typically goes on for about 3 or 4 days, 8 hours a day consecutively. So that means it's about 24 to 32 hours of discussion with breaks and rest and so forth. And the family is always there. They're a vital part of the intervention. And that is more or less what takes place.
Yeah. It seems like dealing with this topic so intensely for so long, it must be heavy to carry. What kind of toll has this field of work taken on you personally?
Well, look, it's been rough. I mean, if you're successful, if you get people out of cults, or if you work with law enforcement and testify as an expert witness in court cases, as I have in 13 states, and most recently I submitted expert testimony at the request of the Attorney General of Guatemala regarding a cult and a cult compound in Guatemala called Lev Tahor, which was composed of people from the United States, Canada, and Israel that had fled investigations in those countries and ended up outside of Guatemala City in a compound, and then the Guatemalan government extracted 160 children who were horribly abused. And eventually, these children were reunited with extended family. I think over 100 have been reunited thus far. And so I was asked by the AG of Guatemala to submit a report because I had dealt with Lev Tahor for years in interventions and through complaints and so on. So what has it done for me? My life has been threatened. I've been under the protection of the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, local police. At one point, there was a cult leader who literally put me on a hit list of people to be murdered, which was reported by CBS News. Uh, I have been sued by cults 5 times for defamation in regards to material that I've made public through culteducation.com, through that very large database that I've been working on and building since 1996. I was sued, for example, by Keith Raniere of Nexium for 14 years. Thankfully, I've been represented by wonderful attorneys and law firms pro bono at no charge, and all of those lawsuits were dismissed. None of them went to trial because they were harassment suits. I've also been tailed by private investigators. I've been under surveillance. I could go on, but suffice to say that I have been successful enough in getting people out and exposing these groups to the extent that they have sought revenge or they have sought to neutralize me in one way or another. And I've dealt with that throughout my career. So if you want to fight against destructive cults and do that day to day and keep doing it as a career, good luck. You will need to be aware that if you're successful, they will come after you. And that is what I've experienced.
Yeah. Well, thank you for doing it. And thank you for being here and educating my audience and all this.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the time.
Thank you all for joining me. Personally, I wish we could have spent the whole time just on the Branch Davidians, because them and the Scientologists are kind of my favorite cults. So as always, here's hoping for round 2 someday. And as always, that depends largely on your support of the channel. So do your liking and subscribing and ringing the bell and whatever you gotta do, and make sure you pick up Rick Alan Ross's book, Cults Inside and Out. And if you really want more, check out the link in the description for more free ways to show your support and keep this love train rolling. Be well, my distant cousins. Be free of suffering and cultish relationships. I'm rooting for you, and you should too.